Welcome to the DaVinci Hour podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Maxwell Cooper, and in this podcast series, I interview physicians, medical innovators, and entrepreneurs making an impact on healthcare. This podcast is produced by DaVinci Academy, a multimedia medical education company that provides podcasts, video courses, and digital textbooks. You can see more on our website, www.dviacademy.com, and our YouTube channel, youtube.com/c/DaVinci Academy Med. This podcast is sponsored by Doc2Doc, the personal lending platform designed for doctors by doctors. Do you have some big expenses in the near future? Maybe you're moving, applying to residency or fellowship, fixing up your car or home, or starting a new practice. Doc2Doc believes that traditional lenders overestimate the risk of lending money to doctors, residents, and medical students, focusing too much on the challenges of their financial past and giving them insufficient credit for the promise of their financial future. Check out Doc2Doc's personal loan options at doc2doclending.com/DaVinci. Hey everybody, welcome back to the DaVinci Hour podcast. I'm honored this week to be joined by Mehdi Maghsoodnia, who is the founder and CEO of 1health, a innovative company out in Silicon Valley. So Mehdi, welcome to the podcast. Appreciate you taking the time.
Hey, thank you, Maxwell, for having me. Appreciate it.
Awesome. So maybe give us a little bit of background on, where you went to school, where you've, been at before 1health, and then kind of maybe just we'll obviously get into the details, but kind of a global overview of what you guys are working on at 1health.
Sure. By the way, I love your name, DaVinci. It's awesome. Yeah, my background is I was one of those kids who, from an early age, wanted to build and innovate. So early on, I was about 6 or 7, told my mother I wanted to be a scientist. I didn't quite know what that meant, but I was taking apart television sets and putting them back together, trying to learn how it was made. So always knew what I wanted to do, which was computer science and design. Was lucky enough to end up at Berkeley and Stanford and learn computer science, and then got into the high tech, early on, building a bunch of different companies in different spaces. I started in sort of the mobile communication space, went into commerce, and now I'm in healthcare. Very excited about healthcare. Feel like it's like the early days of internet, but even bigger, and the impact is more, I think, emotional and real. Like when we were sort of writing the first instances of email or instant messaging applications, it was exciting, but you couldn't really explain to people why they would care. In healthcare, the impact is so much more, and it just feels good to sort of modernize and impact the healthcare industry. So pretty excited to be in this field.
That's awesome. Thanks for that overview. I think that's a really interesting insight you made there, where kind of to the early days of the internet. I think, as you know, medicine and healthcare at large is so slow to adopt new technologies or new ways of doing things, as I'm sure you know all too well. So I think that's an interesting point, and I agree with you. I think it's exciting. There's a lot of room for growth out there. So yeah, tell us about 1health. How did you guys start this company? What was kind of the inspiration? What was the clinical need you were trying to solve, and I guess working on solving?
Yeah. So a lot of my partners at 1health and a lot of my friends in the Valley that build tech platforms, we recognize in other industries, you have built these very, what we sort of call scalable platform technologies, right? You guys intuitively use some of these platforms every day. So your iPhone is a platform that lots of your applications run on it. LinkedIn is a platform. Google is a platform. These are platforms that lots of people in the economy are using in a very scalable fashion. And we recognize that in healthcare, these platforms are missing. So, about 5 years ago, we started looking and said, ideally, you just want to go somewhere and very quickly search for your test results, but you don't have that site. You can't find it. So if I, as a consumer, want to get my test results, I have to log into 16 different platforms. They all have different formats. None of them can talk to each other. So we started identifying these areas that we thought there should be a very scalable system out there, and they don't exist. And in healthcare, given the size of this industry, there are actually hundreds of these platform needs, right? You can just keep going in terms of like there should just be a service to verify and validate your insurance. There should be a service to tell you, if a certain service is within your insurance payment, network or not. All these should be like simple services. They just go in, and you're beginning to see some of them come about in healthcare. I think GoodRx is, an example of that, where you can go and look for any prescription and you see a price out there across different stores. So these services were needed. Me and my bunch of my friends, we said, hey, let's just go build one. We started looking at diagnostics mostly because in the field of diagnostics, almost 90% of your care decisions are made after a test. It is the most important part of your data set. It is the least sort of fuzzy, right? A lot of your clinical data is, they ask you, what's your pain like? Or, how do you feel today? A lot of the notes that doctors write are inconsistent from one doctor to another in terms of the language they use. So it's very difficult to sort of build a scalable data set, but it's very easy to do so around diagnostics, right? Because when you get your genetic test done, or your A1C test done, or your comprehensive panel of blood tests done, the data is pretty consistent. The format of the report might look different, but the underlying data is very consistent. So we started to sort of just create a single platform that understands and consolidates all that data into a single, sort of scalable standard platform. That's what 1health is. We are talking to all the labs out there. We process all different types of tests, and we essentially try to help people get access to testing in a cheaper, faster, simpler fashion. So if we succeed at doing this at scale, and we're obviously early on, and we're doing less than 1% of the testing in the US, but if we actually do succeed to get to a very large scale, you should see 1health in your life in a very simple fashion, right? You will hear that somebody ordered a test on you. You would be able to go in and say where that test is. You get all your results across all the labs in a single platform. And you don't have to log into 16 different platforms and do integration across different hospital labs and independent labs and genetic labs. And so it all will sort of become simple. The way that other platforms have made search simple, or your resume on LinkedIn simple, that sort of model, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's interesting. So obviously it sounds like the patients would be the end user, but are you also working on where physicians themselves would be the end users? Because one of the most frustrating things is, you have a new patient or a new admission, and you don't have any information about this unless they've been seen in your system. If you have to, I think I saw something the other day that the healthcare industry is still one of the highest purchasers of fax machines, which is just crazy. So I think would this help with that, with kind of getting data faster and more easily accessible to the clinicians for new patients?
Yeah, in fact, when you design these sort of very large scale systems, you have to think of all the users, right? So very similar to how Uber has an application that you log in as a user. There's an app you open as a driver, and there's an app you open up as an enterprise administrator to see how your employees have taken Uber rides. So on 1health, you can log in as a physician and you get a totally different view than when you log in as a patient, versus when you log in as a lab, versus when you log in as a payer. So we support all of the players in the ecosystem, and you have to design it in such a way that you meet the needs of all of the players. Otherwise, the platform will not work well. So absolutely, at 1health, you can go into it as a physician. You can sign up for free, and you can enter patients and order tests on those patients across all the labs that are connected to the 1health network. And you can get the results in a standard format, and you can actually do that today. You can just go log in for free. Say, I'm a physician, create your patient. So all of that is built in into the platform. And we spend a lot of time thinking about what does the physician need to get as a value? What should we simplify in their life? What do we simplify in the patient life? What do we simplify in the lab's life? And what do we simplify in the hospital and the payers sort of life? These are all the sort of major players in this process.
Very interesting. I'm curious, how have you been able to get the payers on board? I guess would have been maybe some hurdles or some pushback even that you've gotten from them. And I guess how have you been able? Because I don't know that much about it, but I know that can kind of hinder things, if you will, especially with getting new technologies involved.
Yeah. So today, the way we handle payers is we actually have our lab partners tell us which insurance companies they're in network with. And then we support them in terms of processing claims to those insurance companies. So as you know, the market is highly fragmented. Some labs are in network and some are not in network. We sort of help labs manage those relationships and their claim processing. It's a fairly complicated, fragmented process. Unfortunately, that's another thing that doesn't exist in a very clean fashion in the US. There are no services or APIs, as we call it, in the health industry, where you can't simply go in and say, give me all the labs that are in the United Healthcare network. Now, I'm sure somebody's going to call me tomorrow and say there is an API, but let's just say those APIs are not very accessible and they're not free. So the problem with healthcare is every one of these relationships requires time to establish, and then there are inconsistencies in these services. And to just make it very clear, like in the banking world, you can right now call a set of APIs and ask, I want to know all the routing numbers of all the banks in the US, and there's an API for that. You can, everything has been turned into a very simple service that engineers can write code to. In healthcare, those sort of services don't exist. So everything becomes a long, manual, tedious, and fragmented, fragile process, if that makes sense. So we are sort of getting there by when we come across a service that doesn't exist, we sort of put a placeholder and implement it. But we're very conscious of the fact that we're hoping another team in the US is thinking about solving that, and they would walk up one day and say, we have created a very scalable platform for finding every in-network relationship. And then we would just plug them in and stop doing it ourselves. But these are some of the shortcomings in the healthcare industry today in the US is these sort of very robust service providers don't exist. And so you end up having a lot of custom, badly designed code running in healthcare that I'm sure you are a victim of as a doctor. They probably are giving you login to systems that you pull your hair out because you don't want to log in, and it's complicated, and it's 15 different steps to get something done. So it makes your life very complicated because of the lack of these services, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like I have so many logins, it's not even funny. So yeah, no, I can understand that for sure. I'm curious. So it sounds like, are you working in other countries, and maybe like, a country like the UK, which has like, the National Health Service, where predominantly most of the physicians and the patients are in that area. Is that something where you're finding more ease of adoption of your technology?
No, frankly, the notion that a single payer system in the UK is simpler is not as valid as people think. UK also deals with a lot of legacy infrastructure that's fragmented and broken. Unfortunately, healthcare on a global basis is a very old infrastructure. So I don't think you will see a lot of differences between here and the UK. Yeah, you're dealing with a single payer, but that doesn't mean that payer is sitting on a modernized software stack. They're in fact sitting on a very old legacy, and they have the same issues. And in some ways, when you go to any other country, it's almost like you went just to another state, right? They're not as massive as the US. They're size of like a certain state. So we do see consistency on a state by state basis, but they're all sitting on very old legacy technology. So nowhere in the world have I gone into healthcare and suddenly said, wow, there has been a 20-year investment in R&D, and you're sitting on a modern technology stack. That just doesn't exist. If that makes sense. This is like, it sort of reminds me of the early days of I started at AT&T in the 1990s, and we had that issue, right? The telecommunication infrastructure before wireless was a lot of bad infrastructure that had aged, right? AT&T, I remember as an engineer, we would look at the code, and you had to take a shot at night because you didn't want to deal with that code. It's like, this is really awful. This is like, was written 1950s. And we were trying to put a new wireless network on top of it, which everybody knew it wouldn't work. And eventually we didn't, right? We stood up an alternative network to your legacy home phone. And increasingly now, after 30 years, you're unplugging your main line and using your cell phone. So we rewrote the whole telecom infrastructure from scratch because the landline infrastructure was just not scalable, right? So healthcare is going through the same thing right now. This infrastructure will not scale. And, it's obvious to me sitting here. It's not very obvious to all the hospital administrators holding on to their landlines, thinking that it's going to continue to work. It's going to at some point age out, and you have to deal with a whole new infrastructure.
Yeah, no, I could see that. I mean, where I went to medical school, there was a hospital that I rotated at that was still using paper charts. And I mean, this like I was telling you, I'm still in my residency, so that wasn't that long ago.
Yeah.
And there's in my field of radiology, I mean, it wasn't that long. I mean, it was a couple decades ago, but it wasn't that long ago when we were still using like, printout films to read images versus, before it was all digitized. And, I think the field of pathology right now is kind of going through a transition where they're trying to start digitizing their slides and things like that. So it's, I think your point is actually, I see it just even from the clinical side that things are somewhat antiquated in a way of these kind of these old guard of ways of doing things.
Yeah. Yeah. And the first wave of digitization in industry is they grab what they had that came off the fax machine and they're turning it into a PDF and they store it on a file system. And they call that digitization. That's just archiving, right? It's the same format. It's the same document. You really didn't advance it. You just took a scan of it and you put it on a shared folder. The next wave of digitization is very interesting, right? So when you went from a copy of a resume that was scanned in to LinkedIn, where the data is dynamically linked at a real-time basis, you can click on a company name and go to the company, and from the company go to the employees. And that sort of linkage of diagnostic information is very interesting, which is what we are doing. The sort of scanning of a report to a PDF is not very interesting, because you're sort of sitting there clicking on a PDF saying, take me to the definition of what this gene means. And your PDF will just keep beeping saying, I don't know what you mean by clicking on the screen. That sort of the next level of digitization of data in healthcare will unleash a different level of quality and service that's coming. That's much more exciting than what you see today, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it's not just, pooling data together and like you said, archiving it. It's in a way also like maybe you see these lab values from all these different clinics that a patient's been to, but also like, what does that mean? In a sense, I mean, obviously as a physician, you want to interpret it, but like you said, maybe there's a new genetic test that you've never even heard of or not that familiar with, and you want to learn more about what this means and how you can use this.
Yeah, I run into health systems that say, well, we have digitized our infrastructure, and what they really mean is we have scanned all the records and put it on file. But if you ask them a simple question like, well, right now, just open up a portal and tell me how many female patients that had a BMI of 35 had a genetic variant in the last 2 days. And they look at me like, well, we can't do that. It's like, well, that means your data is not really digitized. It's just you have a bunch of scanned files.
Yeah,
essentially. You can't really query through your data. You really don't have access to your data. You just have files online that you can read. That level of storage and archiving is not really advancing. It's record keeping, right? It's cleaning up your data, but it's not really bringing your data to life. To bring data to life, you have to understand the underlying elements of data as a first-class object. So in a real system, in our system, for example, we understand every test result as a fundamental active data set. we are not keeping PDFs. We understand that you just did a genetic test and what that tumor, analysis means. We understand what it means when you do a germline analysis of somebody. We understand the underlying SNPs for doctor. I think with your background, you probably understand. We can follow the population health data real time in the data set, which is very unusual in healthcare, right?
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, I imagine even from both like internal just kind of assessments and then also doing like large scale clinical research, this would be extremely valuable because in the old days, it's kind of relied on like people like me or medical students to kind of comb through all that data and put it all together and everything. Which is if you had it like one place where you could easily search and itemize it, that would change the game.
Yeah, that would be like having Google in healthcare, right? Like
Yes.
you're just now used to going to Google and saying what's the address of this business. But in healthcare, you can't do that with your patient data. Like just telling me how many of my patients had the following variant in the last 24 hours. You should be able to do that really fast and quick and easy, but that just doesn't exist, right?
Interesting. So you alluded a little bit to this. What has been some of the obstacles you faced with like the health systems? Because as you know, the health systems are, they can be very bureaucratic. Like you said, they can be a little bit, slow to change or slow to adopt things. What have been kind of some of the obstacles or questions you've received, and how have you, tried to overcome those or answer those questions?
Yeah, the challenges in the health systems in the US is these are massive businesses, right? There's a lot of complexity, and they're getting bombarded with innovation, right? They're getting calls every day saying, here's a new cardiovascular device, here's a new cardiovascular app, here's a new pain medication, so the number of calls they're getting is just so high, right? And for them to process true innovation right now itself is your first class problem, right? Like, which it would be, it's the same thing as in the early days of mobile phone, consumers suddenly had 1,000 applications. You don't know which one you want to download. So healthcare systems are getting bombarded with solutions, and just getting their attention is the number one problem. Then even if you get their attention, their ability to deploy innovation is very difficult for them, right? They don't, they're where enterprise software was 1995, right? So if you went to McDonald's in 1995, or if you went to Citigroup or Goldman Sachs, or you went to, I don't know, Visa, and you said, here's a new innovation you should deploy, they didn't have the infrastructure, right? The IT infrastructure wasn't rich enough to deploy innovation. They were all running on IBM in 1995. IBM didn't have very sophisticated partnership infrastructure. And they would say, well, that would take us 2 years to integrate, come back, and we might be able to put a new reporting subsystem in place. And it took 10 years for the enterprise space to deploy innovation, right? So you had to wait until 2005 before in the enterprise space, people realized that there is an application for marketing, for advertising, for employee management, for HR, for finance. Now in the US enterprise space, there are hundreds and hundreds of software applications, highly customized for different industries and segments, right? In healthcare, you essentially have one system called Epic running the whole department. It's trying to be the best application for the cardiovascular, for pain, for MSK, for oncology. And you don't have an infrastructure for innovation, right, in healthcare today. So even if you brought the best solution to the market, it would take you literally a year to get somebody to deploy. And when they do, because the infrastructure isn't very advanced, they tend to run into deployment issues, adoption issues. So it would take time. I tell people, if you're coming into healthcare thinking you can just deploy an app and succeed, it's a bit naive, right? The infrastructure doesn't exist, and you have to be patient enough, and you have to be clever enough to understand what it is you can and can't do, and in which part of the market, right? There are parts of the healthcare market you can innovate faster because they're more nimble. They're nursing homes and the clinics and urgent care centers. They're more nimble. They adopt faster. And then you get into these large healthcare systems, very difficult to navigate, right? And it's not that you have very good people, very good intention. In fact, I have to say, I've worked in a lot of different industries. I've rarely ran into an industry where there were so many good people with good intentions. I just sit in some of these rooms where the nurses and the doctors are trying to solve a problem. And it's amazing how many good people are in this industry and how good intention they are and how hard they're working. Unfortunately, the underlying tools we have given them is very primitive. So it's sort of, I leave some of these conversations in pain because I feel like, the same group of people with the same intention in finance have so many modern tools in transportation, in logistics, in HR, and you run into healthcare and they're given really bad tools and they're like, they don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the tool sets, and you're asking them to pick up problems that are very complex. And I feel for them. I feel like, oh my God, you guys work hard.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. I think our lives could be probably made a lot easier by technology. And I think that's an interesting comparison to some of these other, like in finance
Oh,
or
incredible amount of time that goes into just, it's incredible the amount of time that goes into just keeping track. I'm watching, so as a product person, I walk into these hospitals and I watch people's behavior and I'm looking at the amount of inefficiency, just keeping track of, and these are sensitive data sets, right? So like, in order for them not to make a mistake, they have to keep checking the paper 3 times. What was the prescription and what was the order? And does the name of the patient match? And you're watching this saying, oh my God, there's like almost 30% of the time is going into overcoming shortcomings of systems, right? This is like, it's a crazy amount of time that goes into it.
I also, yeah, I mean, one thing, as just day to day, we try to keep track of our patients and what's going on with them and, their labs, what's the recent updates. And yeah, like you said, like Epic can make certain lists and things like that, but I haven't met someone who just simply relies on that. I mean, maybe if they're, sharp enough, they can keep it all in their head, but most of us have to write things down. We have to change the way the thing is. And there's not a lot of, maybe I'm just naive to it, but I feel like there's not a great tool out there for like, even just day to day, keeping track of like what's going on with your patients in real time and having that all like at your fingertips. You have to comb through all this stuff just to even keep track of everything.
No, and honestly, there isn't. And to put it in perspective, I mean, this is not hard to see. Just go to a modern marketing team in any other industry. Let's go, marketing in the auto industry, marketing in the shoe industry, and ask him how many software vendors are providing them applications for just modernizing their task, just to run marketing. There are at least 100 different software platforms just to optimize marketing for the team at Nike. Just to give you an example. And then you go into a hospital and you look at oncology and they're like 2. And you compare, like there's a team running marketing for Nike and there are more software people solving their problems than you watch an oncology department, and there are 2 teams and the 2 teams serving them are not good software people. The only reason they're there is because they sort of happen through legacy to get there. And I don't mean to be, I'm not being negative about, it's not that they're not good intentioned people. These are not the best software programmers. So like the tools that they're providing to oncologists or to cardiovascular people or to pain, you don't watch those platforms and you say, oh my God, this just blows me away. This is the best piece of software I've seen. So in comparison, the number of people coming to rescue to make your life easier just is not high, right? You don't have that sort of competitive space of innovation that's driving the care pathway forward, right? So it puts a lot of the burden on your shoulders as doctors because you don't have the tools. Where you go to finance and somebody's doing, I don't know, for God's sake, somebody's doing like short stock exchange and they have like 15 different tools. Give me the trending, how many stock collapsed in the past 2 days, and then you go into like a healthcare situation. It's like, show me across the US how many people had this condition the past 24 hours, what therapies worked and what medications, what were the side effects. None of this data is really just available. It's just difficult to see how primitive that infrastructure is for healthcare, right?
That's interesting. As kind of one of the big hot topics in healthcare tech is AI and how that solve so many problems and all that. And especially in my field of radiology, I think it's been earlier to adopt that than others. I'm curious, where has AI gonna play a role in I guess in general, like
I
in all this?
studied AI at Berkeley. My undergrad degree was in fuzzy logic and artificial intelligence. And honestly, I think it's a lot of noise and buzzword, right? People who talk about AI in healthcare most often don't understand what AI is. And I think it's overblown. And the reason for that is healthcare just needs basic infrastructure tools right now. So it's sort of hard to to go into a field that has almost no good infrastructure and say, I'm going to take you from nothing to advanced AI. You don't even have big data sets that are aggregated in a clean fashion for any AI engine to learn. Now, there are very few exceptions. Like you might argue that imaging is an area where, because you're taking an image and that image tends to be standard, maybe AI algorithms can actually be trained. That's an interesting exception. But just to be clear, that's an exception. Almost no other area in healthcare have I seen enough clean data getting aggregated with enough of a semantical meaning for AI engines to learn, right? And when they do so, when they aggregate the data, they do it with such a high cost and in such an inorganic fashion that you sort of watching it saying, it's like you work so hard to create a data set that only has 100,000 patients. And you want to now create an AI engine on top of it. And, it's like you only think about AI engines when you have a clean infrastructure that's aggregating data at a tremendous rate. Like look at Google Photo. Google Photo is a beautiful example of you're aggregating millions of pictures of people every second in an organic fashion. You're not working very hard. People are just uploading pictures all the time, right? So for you as an AI engineer to sit there and say, I'm going to write an algorithm to recognize a face, is fairly easy because you're getting 1,000 faces a minute. So you will test yourself very quickly. Did I recognize the right face? Is the algorithm getting better? Is it working? That sort of environment where you have massive aggregation of data in a cost-effective fashion, AI algorithms make sense. In healthcare, you don't have the basic infrastructure. So people come to me and say, we're building AI for X or Y. I'm like, you don't even have the infrastructure for payment. You can't even make insurance payments scalable. Like, how would you bring an AI engine into an environment where your underlying data assets are so costly to assemble in a clean fashion? And so think of AI engines only work if the underlying data set is really, really clean. Like a face is a face, you see it. In healthcare, every time somebody brings me a data set, half of the data has been manually cleaned. Like even the claims code don't match and the notes don't match. And so you're going to spend all your time cleaning data. You're not going to advance any AI algorithms. So I think it's a lot of sort of excitement where we should be focusing on building basic infrastructure, right? This is like you don't have the road system and people are talking about, I want a Tesla electric car. It's like, for God's sake, you don't have the road system yet. You can't even get a diesel car on these roads because the infrastructure is so bad, right?
Right. Yeah, I think that's interesting. And I remember someone talking about an interesting application for AI would be like tracking lab data, exactly like what you're doing, because, so many clinicians, and part of it is because we're just so busy. We look at the most recent, we look at the current and maybe like the last one, what it was 3 months ago or whatever, or, what it was yesterday. But imagine if you could have something tell you the trend over the last, couple of years, or something like that, especially for like a primary care physician. I'm curious, have you thought about ways of integrating something like that into what you guys are doing?
Yeah, we are providing that, but that's actually not AI, honestly. Those are very simple rule-based notification systems, and we are building that into the platform. But if you tell my engineers that's AI, they would sort of smile and walk away. That's not AI. That's just providing simpler reporting for physicians, right? Enabling you to get faster analytics. So AI would be when you can infer and decide on complex patterns that are not obvious, right, and difficult to do, and that's a very different level of algorithm and functionality. I think imaging is where you're going to see AI. Actually, honestly, that's where and because we're doing so much optimize AI algorithms in face recognition, applying those sort of visual recognition algorithms to imaging, it will probably be your fastest path to success. But the rest of what people are talking about is mostly just advanced notification analytics, and that's coming. I think that's just the basics of infrastructure you need to build.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's it's funny. You hear, it's interesting to hear you talk about how some of these statements about AI are maybe even overblown, or not even where people fully realize, like you said, that's not technically that's not AI. It's funny how because it's such a, like, you go to these conferences and stuff, and it's such a, like, everybody's talking about it, everybody's like presenting about it, and it's just
no. And my head of engineering. My head of engineering is an old friend, and every time he's new to healthcare, I drag them out of mobile and communication to healthcare. And every time he meets people and they tell him about AI and then they explain what he's doing, he looks at me and he says, "That's literally like 4 lines of code that we would, in engineering, we will call it a lookup table." and they describe it as AI, and we're like, that's like looking at a bike and saying that's an electric car. That's so simple a piece of code. It's not even close to being AI. The problem is there's this, there's this marketing buzz going on where they want to, unfortunately, in healthcare, point solutions that are solving a simple problem need to extract a lot of dollars, right? So from a marketing perspective. And if you walked up to someone and you said, and I don't want to name someone or say something that would insult somebody in the market, but think of, like, if I walked up to you and said, this is a simple lookup table, you will pay me $1,000 a month for it. But if I said this is an AI engine, you might pay me $10,000 a month for it. So there's a lot of marketing going on, packaging things that are fairly simple and not very protective from a software perspective. They put the AI brand on it to protect their position in the market. But long term, it's going to wash out. None of these things are very sophisticated piece of software, and they can be replicated very easily, very cheaply, and you can't protect it through patents. These are not, and I've been to a lot of markets where people try to do that. They say, like, what I did is so unique, and any court of law listening to the underlying technology realize that's just not true. There's no secret sauce in what you're doing in that code.
Interesting. Another thing you mentioned, I think, when you were first talking about giving us an overview of the company, was how to help improve costs, because, as you know, that's such a ever-going problem in the U.S. healthcare system, especially, is how do we cut costs, how do we keep costs low, keep things efficient. I guess, how is your technology helping with that specifically?
The way you generally in the market lower cost is you increase supply, right? You increase availability of testing. So the problem in the healthcare market today is you have very few competitors. So let's just take an example of a genetic test, right? So a genetic test that you charge $1,000 for in the market today, the underlying technology for running it might cost you $100. And the reason the cost structure is so much higher is the number of providers are not that high. So you have very few choices for running a complex molecular test. So the way you drop the price down is you allow people to compete. And the problem with competition today is, it's very difficult to come to market in healthcare and to be a competing lab, right? And I'm sure you intuitively understand that, because when you go to do certain tests, you might have one vendor offering that test in your EMR, EHR, one, not two, just one. So in any market where there's only one provider of anything, you have pricing control. So all we're doing is we're essentially taking away friction so that more people can enter the market, right? We're trying to make sure that when you, as a doctor, you go to order, you at least see 3 labs or 4. Right? If I can get you to see 3 or 4 labs, the price will naturally be more competitive. Because as a physician, or even just as a consumer, you could say, well, if there are 4 people and they're identical tests, can I get the cheapest one that's closer to me? Right? So we're trying to introduce competition in the market by taking the friction away. Right now, for a lab to show up on your menu and your EHR, they have to have an army of engineers to integrate with Cerner and Epic, and years and years of coding to end up there, and they can't afford it. So you don't see competition in your product offering.
Oh, I see. So making it not only making all the data more accessible, but also those companies that are responsible for generating the lab results, allowing them even more, they themselves more access to
Yeah,
the
just you
healthcare
should have
system.
more labs competing for your business, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you should be in a position where you want to go order any tests. You see a healthy group of labs competing for your business. And frankly, you should sort of see what's the closest lab to me with the fastest turnaround time that has, had a high customer satisfaction. Like, and all of that is measurable. Like in the past 10 orders, did you turn around in 24 hours or less? And are you reliable, clear certified lab? And if you get a bunch of those on your menu, you naturally will have more competition. Right?
Sure, sure. No, that makes sense. That makes sense. I guess what are your guys like future directions? Where you got what's like the next steps? Where you guys hoping to go with kind of like the next 6 to 12 months? What are your milestones you're hoping to shoot for?
We are very much focused on right now putting more testing products and labs in front of our physician network. So what we're doing is making sure that more and more labs that are out there providing testing services can join our network and therefore provide their offerings to the market, help them come to market, help them connect to you as a physician, others as physicians on your EHRs, EMRs, and systems out there, and to make that whole process just simpler for everybody involved. That's our focus. And if we succeed at this by end of this year, we will be over 100 different labs across all 50 states on the 1health platform. And we continue to add those labs to our network every month. So hopefully you will see more and more labs light up across the US. You will have more and more choices, more and more providers, and your patients will get better and better service, and the process will get simpler and simpler, and you feel like, wow, okay. And just intelligence built into the platform, right? So if you experience 1health, we will let you know if the test isn't being completed. We will let you know if the insurance didn't approve or didn't pay. We will let you know. It's all the platform is just providing a lot more visibility to the underlying process to everybody involved, not just you. The patient would know that there was a test ordered on them that they haven't completed. The lab would know that the test was ordered and the sample hasn't arrived. So that sort of notification will be visible to everybody as to what's not working in the process.
Very interesting. Very interesting. I'm curious, what have you guys done in terms of like just as a startup, like funding wise, like where you guys are at in that kind of sequence of things, and what's kind of do you have
We
any
have
like
raised
funding?
we have raised 2 rounds,
Okay.
and in the past 4 years, we have processed over 4 million test orders, and we have done around 200,000 genetic tests on the platform that are obviously far more complicated and larger in data set than your normal A1C or your normal LDL, HDL test, right? So some of these genetic tests, you get 1 million data points that you have to process. So you're very much adding a lot of complex tests to the platform as well as just simple clinical tests. But that's sort of the rate of growth, and we expect to be probably profitable by 2024. So
Oh
that's
wow.
our sort of path in terms of execution. Yeah.
Excellent, excellent. As we wrap up here, I'm curious. As a serial entrepreneur yourself, you've this is not your first rodeo. You've done this before. I guess what's your advice for there's a million ideas out there, as you know. Like when should an entrepreneur know like, hey, this is like something worth pursuing. This is like I should really go all in on this or spend a significant amount of time or even potentially money as well. I guess what's kind of like the different ventures you've been involved with, what's kind of been if there is a common theme among all of them that's attracted you to get involved?
There is. It's really not a common theme. We live in a very complex world, and there's so many market segments and so many problem sets. I would say that the more important themes to pay attention to is the number one is your team, who you surround yourself with. Regardless of what market you're in, the team is probably your number one is your biggest area of focus, that you should always recruit the best people around you, and who have the right sort of culture, motivation, and really sort of buy into the mission, because building things is a very, very difficult process, and you just can't pay people to love it. People have to come into this field where they love doing what they're doing. Pay is like secondary, right? So I always sort of say, if you're in a startup because of pay, you need to get out. This is not a job. This is a job of passion and love and commitment, and obviously the pay has to be good enough for you to have a nice lifestyle, but it has to be based on passion and mission. But outside of the team, then it gets very complicated, right? So you have to ask a lot of questions around, is the problem big enough? Is it in an area that you're interested in solving? Is the timing right? Does the world really need it solved today? Are they willing to focus on it? There are a lot of problems in the world that we just can't fix today, because unfortunately we have a lot of other problems in front of us, right? So if you're not in the top of the list, you're not going to get attention and focus. So you have to ask a lot of questions around market size, timing, competition. Are we ready to solve it? Do we have maturity of technology? Do we have regulatory barriers? There's a lot of sort of questions coming depending on what market segment you're in. But there is no simple answer, and it's very unique to the market, right? For example, I really don't have a lot of insights to biotech or medical devices. I don't know. It's not my area of expertise. But I built a lot of commerce platforms. I built a lot of direct-to-consumer healthcare and enterprise. So those are the areas where I can sort of add some value. But also find mentors around you that know that space, right? Because that really matters, what area you have experience of, what you have done in the past, right?
Sure. I'm curious, just from a business partner standpoint, because you could almost look at a business partnership, and I don't have to tell you this, it's similar to, it's almost like a marriage. I mean, it's like especially if you're going to share equity and ownership and things like that, it's a legally binding relationship. And, it's not something you hope it to be a long-term thing, not a, 2-month long thing. So I'm curious because just because someone's a good friend of yours doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be a good business partner of yours. I think sometimes people make that mistake of mixing personal relationships and business. I'm just curious, from your standpoint, you've had a lot of experience doing this. Like what kind of criteria or methods do you use for kind of selecting who you go into business with?
The first thing is you have to pick partners that have, very high ethics. And again, overall, they have to be really good human beings that you trust, and you feel like their sort of their culture is aligned with you. Outside of that, that's just the baseline, right? Then on top of it, you're asking the question of core competency and skill set. Like any other team that you assemble, I'm sure people who are coaching basketball teams or football teams understand this intuitively, which is, if the underlying temperament and culture doesn't work, it doesn't matter what your talent is. The team dynamic just doesn't work. But if the culture and temperament works, then you're assembling a team based on skill sets, right? So it's like any other team you're building. You have to ask yourself, what are the skill sets that you need to have in this team? And who are those sort of people that bring that skill set with the right culture and temperament, right? If the underlying culture doesn't work, you can hire the biggest expert in finance to join your team, but if the person just is culturally not a fit, it would distort the execution of the team. So as a founder / CEO, you're sort of a coach assembling a team, and you have to pay attention to those dynamics, right? Do you have the right culture? Do you have the right temperament? And then do you have the right skill set in the team? Is everybody an extrovert and nobody is allowing anybody else to talk? Do you have enough introverts, extroverts? Do you have enough, problem solvers? Do you have enough doers? There are people who are very good at executing. There are people who are very good at planning. So you have to sort of balance out between your team members. Like, do you have enough of the skill set? And then you recognize who you lead with, right? So if you lead with the wrong person in the wrong sort of time or segment of the market, then you have really awkward results, right? So it's like if you have these doers in your team who like to sort of shoot and ask question next, if you send them into new markets, you're going to be very surprised. But if you have more methodical people who analyze and do discovery, you get better feedback. So you have to sort of judge as to what market you're going into, what situation are you in the market, and then who in your team is leading that sort of challenge, right?
Sure. No, that's great advice. That makes a lot of sense. I guess my last question, I ask every guest this: when you're not building companies or running 1health, what are your passions? How do you find that balance if there is one?
Yeah, I actually love learning. So just my nature is I spend a lot of time with my kids and family, and then I try to learn. So I watch a lot of documentaries, news, read books, read articles, have discussions with friends, and then I love playing chess, and I love playing with my son. I play volleyball and soccer, and stuff like that.
That's awesome. Awesome.
Yeah.
I guess last thing here is where can people find out more about 1health, how and connect with yourself as well?
Probably on the website is probably the best place to go. And there's a button you can set up a meeting, and the team will immediately engage and tell you what we do, and if it's a fit for your target market. And I'm on LinkedIn. Probably my contact information is everywhere, but I'm at 1health.io.
Perfect. We'll definitely link that stuff in the description. Mehdi, thanks again. I really enjoyed this conversation.
I really enjoyed it too. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DaVinci Hour podcast, presented by DaVinci Academy. Please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow the podcast on your podcast platform of choice to catch the latest episodes. Please leave a comment or a review and share it with a friend. Lastly, you can find all of our podcasts, video courses, and books on our website, dviacademy.com. Thank you for listening.